Chapter 18. But other passengers were approaching Lincoln meanwhile by other roads on foot. A county town draws the inhabitants of all vicarages, farms, country houses, and wayside cottages, within a radius of 10 miles at least. Once or twice a week to its streets, and among them, on this occasion, were Ralph Denham and Mary Datchet. They despised the roads, and took their way across the fields, and yet, from their appearance, it did not seem as if they cared much where they walked so long as the way did not actually trip them up. When they left the vicarage, they had begun an argument which swung their feet along so rhythmically in time with it that they covered the ground at over 4 miles an hour. And saw nothing of the hedgerows, the swelling ploughland, or the mild blue sky. What they saw were the Houses of Parliament and the government offices in Whitehall. They both belonged to the class which is conscious of having lost its birthright in these great structures and is seeking to build another kind of lodging for its own notion of law and government. Purposely, perhaps, Mary did not agree with Ralph. She loved to feel her mind in conflict with his, and to be certain that he spared her female judgment no ounce of his male muscularity. He seemed to argue as fiercely with her as if she were his brother. They were alike, however, in believing that it behooved them to take in hand the repair and reconstruction of the fabric of England. They agreed in thinking that nature has not been generous in the endowment of our councillors. They agreed, unconsciously, in a mute love for the muddy field through which they tramped, with eyes narrowed close by the concentration of their minds. At length they drew breath, let the argument fly away into the limbo of other good arguments, and, leaning over a gate, opened their eyes for the first time and looked about them. Their feet tingled with warm blood and their breath rose in steam around them. The bodily exercise made them both feel more direct and less self-conscious than usual, and Mary, indeed, was overcome by a sort of lightheadedness which made it seem to her that it mattered very little what happened next. It mattered so little, indeed, that she felt herself on the point of saying to Ralph, "I love you, I shall never love anybody else. Marry me or leave me, think what you like of me, I don't care a straw." At the moment, however, speech or silence seemed immaterial, and she merely clapped her hands together and looked at the distant woods with the rust-like bloom on their brown, and the green and blue landscape through the steam of her own breath. It seemed a mere toss-up whether she said, "I love you," or whether she said, "I love the beech trees," or only, "I love, I love." "Do you know, Mary," Ralph suddenly interrupted her, "I've made up my mind." Her indifference must have been superficial, for it disappeared at once. Indeed, she lost sight of the trees, and saw her own hand upon the topmost bar of the gate with extreme distinctness, while he went on. "I've made up my mind to chuck my work and live down here. I want you to tell me about that cottage you spoke of. However, I suppose there'll be no difficulty about getting a cottage, will there?" He spoke with an assumption of carelessness as if expecting her to dissuade him. She still waited, as if for him to continue. She was convinced that in some roundabout way he approached the subject of their marriage. "I can't stand the office any longer," he proceeded. "I don't know what my family will say, but I'm sure I'm right. Don't you think so? Live down here by yourself?" She asked. "Some old woman would do for me, I suppose," he replied. "I'm sick of the whole thing," he went on, and opened the gate with a jerk. They began to cross the next field walking side by side. "I tell you, Mary, it's utter destruction, working away, day after day, at stuff that doesn't matter a damn to anyone. I've stood 8 years of it, and I'm not going to stand it any longer. I suppose this all seems to you mad, though?" By this time Mary had recovered her self-control. "I thought you weren't happy," she said. "Why did you think that?" he asked, with some surprise. "Don't you remember that morning in Lincoln's Inn Fields?" she asked. "Yes," said Ralph, slackening his pace and remembering Catherine and her engagement. The purple leaves stamped into the path, the white paper radiant under the electric light, and the hopelessness which seemed to surround all these things. "You're right, Mary," he said, with something of an effort, "though I don't know how you guessed it." She was silent, hoping that he might tell her the reason of his unhappiness, for his excuses had not deceived her. "I was unhappy, very unhappy." He repeated. Some 6 weeks separated him from that afternoon when he had sat upon the embankment watching his visions dissolve in mist as the waters swam past, and the sense of his desolation still made him shiver. He had not recovered in the least from that depression. Here was an opportunity for making himself face it, as he felt that he ought to, for, by this time, no doubt, it was only a sentimental ghost, better exorcised by ruthless exposure to such an eye as Mary's, than allowed to underlie all his actions and thoughts, as had been the case ever since he first saw Catherine Hilbery pouring out tea. He must begin, however, by mentioning her name, and this he found it impossible to do. He persuaded himself that he could make an honest statement without speaking her name. He persuaded himself that his feeling had very little to do with her. "Unhappiness is a state of mind," he said, "by which I mean that it is not necessarily the result of any particular cause." This rather stilted beginning did not please him, and it became more and more obvious to him that, whatever he might say, his unhappiness had been directly caused by Catherine. "I began to find my life unsatisfactory," he started afresh. "It seemed to me meaningless." He paused again, but felt that this, at any rate, was true, and that on these lines he could go on. "All this money-making and working 10 hours a day in an office, what's it for? When one's a boy, you see, one's head is so full of dreams that it doesn't seem to matter what one does. And if you're ambitious, you're all right, you've got a reason for going on. Now my reasons ceased to satisfy me. Perhaps I never had any. That's very likely now I come to think of it. What reason is there for anything, though? Still, it's impossible, after a certain age, to take oneself in satisfactorily. And I know what carried me on, for a good reason now occurred to him. I wanted to be the savior of my family and all that kind of thing. I wanted them to get on in the world. That was a lie, of course, a kind of self-glorification, too. Like most people, I suppose, I've lived almost entirely among delusions, and now I'm at the awkward stage of finding it out. I want another delusion to go on with. That's what my unhappiness amounts to, Mary." There were 2 reasons that kept Mary very silent during this speech, and drew curiously straight lines upon her face. In the first place, Ralph made no mention of marriage. In the second, he was not speaking the truth. "I don't think it will be difficult to find a cottage," she said, with cheerful hardness, ignoring the whole of this statement. "You've got a little money, haven't you?" "Yes," she concluded. "I don't see why it shouldn't be a very good plan." They crossed the field in complete silence. Ralph was surprised by her remark and a little hurt, and yet, on the whole, rather pleased. He had convinced himself that it was impossible to lay his case truthfully before Mary. And, secretly, he was relieved to find that he had not parted with his dream to her. She was, as he had always found her, the sensible, loyal friend, the woman he trusted, whose sympathy he could count upon, provided he kept within certain limits. He was not displeased to find that those limits were very clearly marked. When they had crossed the next hedge, she said to him, "Yes, Ralph, it's time you made a break. I've come to the same conclusion myself. Only it won't be a country cottage in my case, it'll be America." "America." She CRI. "That's the place for me. They'll teach me something about organizing a movement there, and I'll come back and show you how to do it." If she meant consciously or unconsciously to belittle the seclusion and security of a country cottage, she did not succeed, for Ralph's determination was genuine. But she made him visualize her in her own character, so that he looked quickly at her, as she walked a little in front of him across the plowed field. For the first time that morning he saw her independently of him or of his preoccupation with Catherine. He seemed to see her marching ahead, a rather clumsy but powerful and independent figure, for whose courage he felt the greatest respect. "Don't go away, Mary," he exclaimed, and stop addition, "That's what you said before, Ralph," she returned, without looking at him. "You want to go away yourself, and you don't want me to go away. That's not very sensible, is it?" "Mary," he cried, stung by the remembrance of his exacting and dictatorial ways with her, "what a brute I've been to you." It took all her strength to keep the tears from springing, and to thrust back her assurance that she would forgive him till doomsday if he chose. She was preserved from doing so only by a stubborn kind of respect for herself which lay at the root of her nature and forbade surrender, even in moments of almost overwhelming passion. Now, when all was tempest and high-running waves, she knew of a land where the sun shone clear upon Italian grammars and files of docketed papers. Nevertheless, from the skeleton pallor of that land and the rocks that broke its surface, she knew that her life there would be harsh and lonely almost beyond endurance. She walked steadily a little in front of him across the plowed field. Their way took them round the verge of a wood of thin trees standing at the edge of a steep fold in the land. Looking between the tree trunks, Ralph saw laid out on the perfectly flat and richly green meadow at the bottom of the hill a small grey manor house. With ponds, terraces, and clipped hedges in front of it, a farm building or so at the side, and a screen of fir trees rising behind. All perfectly sheltered and self-sufficient. Behind the house the hill rose again, and the trees on the farther summit stood upright against the sky, which appeared of a more intense blue between their trunks. His mind at once was filled with a sense of the actual presence of Catherine. The grey house and the intense blue sky gave him the feeling of her presence close by. He leant against a tree, forming her name beneath his breath. "Catherine, Catherine," he said aloud. And then, looking round, saw Mary walking slowly away from him, tearing a long spray of ivy from the trees as she passed them. She seemed so definitely opposed to the vision he held in his mind that he returned to it with a gesture of impatience. "Catherine, Catherine," he repeated, and seemed to himself to be with her. He lost his sense of all that surrounded him, all substantial things, the hour of the day, what we have done and are about to do. The presence of other people and the support we derive from seeing their belief in a common reality, all this slipped from him. So he might have felt if the earth had dropped from his feet, and the empty blue had hung all round him, and the air had been steeped in the presence of one woman. The chirp of a robin on the bough above his head awakened him, and his awakenment was accompanied by a sigh. Here was the world in which he had lived, here the ploughed field, the high road yonder, and Mary, stripping ivy from the trees. When he came up with her he linked his arm through hers and said, "Now, Mary, what's all this about America?" There was a brotherly kindness in his voice which seemed to her magnanimous, when she reflected that she had cut short his explanations and shown little interest in his change of plan. She gave him her reasons for thinking that she might profit by such a journey, omitting the one reason which had set all the rest in motion. He listened attentively, and made no attempt to dissuade her. In truth, he found himself curiously eager to make certain of her good sense, and accepted each fresh proof of it with satisfaction, as though it helped him to make up his mind about something. She forgot the pain he had caused her, and in place of it she became conscious of a steady tide of well-being which harmonized very aptly with the tramp of their feet upon the dry road and the support of his room. The comfort was the more glowing in that it seemed to be the reward of her determination to behave to him simply and without attempting to be other than she was. Instead of making out an interest in the poets, she avoided them instinctively, and dwelt rather insistently upon the practical nature of her gifts. In a practical way she asked for particulars of his cottage, which hardly existed in his mind, and corrected his vagueness. "You must see that there's water," she insisted. With an exaggeration of established, she avoided asking him what he meant to do in this cottage. And, at last, when all the practical details had been thrashed out as much as possible, he rewarded her by a more intimate statement. "One of the rooms," he said, "must be my study, for, you see, Mary, I'm going to write a book." Here he withdrew his arm from hers, lit his pipe, and they tramped on in a sagacious kind of comradeship, the most complete they had attained in all their friendship. "And what's your book to be about?" she said, as boldly as if she had never come to grief with Ralph in talking about books. He told her unhesitatingly that he meant to write the history of the English village from Saxon days to the present time. Some such plan had lain as a seed in his mind for many years, and now that he had decided, in a flash, to give up his profession, the seed grew in the space of 20 minutes both tall and lusty. He was surprised himself at the positive way in which he spoke. It was the same with the question of his cottage. That had come into existence, too, in an unromantic shapé square white house standing just off the high road. No doubt, with a neighbor who kept a pig and a dozen squalling children, for these plans were shorn of all romance in his mind. And the pleasure he derived from thinking of them was checked directly it passed a very sober limit. So a sensible man who has lost his chance of some beautiful inheritance might tread out the narrow bounds of his actual dwelling place, and assure himself that life is supportable within its domain. Only one must grow turnips and cabbages, not melons and pomegranates. Certainly Ralph took some pride in the resources of his mind, and was insensibly helped to right himself by Mary's trust in him. She wound her ivy spray round her ash plant, and for the first time for many days, when alone with Ralph, set no spies upon her motives, sayings, and feelings, but surrendered herself to complete happiness. Thus talking, with easy silences and some pauses to look at the view over the hedge and to decide upon the species of a little gray-brown bird slipping among the twigs, they walked into Lincoln, and after strolling up and down the main street, decided upon an inn where the rounded window suggested substantial fare. Nor were they mistaken. For over 150 years hot joints, potatoes, greens, and apple puddings had been served to generations of country gentlemen. And now, sitting at a table in the hollow of the bow window, Ralph and Mary took their share of this perennial feasance looking across the joint. Halfway through the meal, Mary wondered whether Ralph would ever come to look quite like the other people in the room. Would he be absorbed among the round pink faces, pricked with little white bristles, the calves fitted in shiny brown leather? The black and white check suits, which were sprinkled about in the same room with them? She half hoped so. She thought that it was only in his mind that he was different. She did not wish him to be too different from other people. The walk had given him a ruddy color, too, and his eyes were lit up by a steady, honest light, which could not make the simplest farmer feel ill at ease, or suggest to the most devout of clergymen a disposition to sneer at his faith. She loved the steep cliff of his forehead, and compared it to the brow of a young Greek horseman, who reins his horse back so sharply that it half falls on its haunches. He always seemed to her like a rider on a spirited horse. And there was an exaltation to her in being with him, because there was a risk that he would not be able to keep to the right pace among other people. Sitting opposite him at the little table in the window, she came back to that state of careless exaltation which had overcome her when they halted by the gate. But now it was accompanied by a sense of sanity and security, for she felt that they had a feeling in common which scarcely needed embodiment in words. How silent he was! Leaning his forehead on his hand, now and then, and again looking steadily and gravely at the backs of the two men at the next table. with so little self-consciousness that she could almost watch his mind placing one thought solidly upon the top of another. She thought that she could feel him thinking, through the shade of her fingers. And she could anticipate the exact moment when he would put an end to his thought and turn a little in his chair and say, "Well, Mary Dash?" inviting her to take up the thread of thought where he had dropped it. And at that very moment he turned just so, and said, "Well, Mary?" with the curious touch of diffidence which she loved in him. She laughed, and she explained her laugh on the spur of the moment by the look of the people in the street below. There was a motor car with an old lady swathed in blue veils, and a lady's maid on the seat opposite. Holding a King Charles's spaniel, there was a countrywoman wheeling a perambulator full of sticks down the middle of the road. There was a bailiff in gaiters discussing the state of the cattle market with a dissenting minister, so she defined them. She ran over this list without any fear that her companion would think her trivial. Indeed, whether it was due to the warmth of the room or to the good roast beef, or whether Ralph had achieved the process which is called making up one's mind. Certainly he had given up testing the good sense, the independent character, the intelligence shown in her remarks. He had been building one of those piles of thought, as ramshackle and fantastic as a Chinese pagoda, half from words let fall by gentlemen in gaiters, half from the litter in his own mind, about duck shooting and legal history, about the Roman occupation of Lincoln and the relations of country gentlemen with their wives. When, from all this disconnected rambling, there suddenly formed itself in his mind the idea that he would ask Mary to marry him. The idea was so spontaneous that it seemed to shape itself of its own accord before his eyes. It was then that he turned round and made use of his old, instinctive phrase. "Well, Mary Dash?" As it presented itself to him at first, the idea was so new and interesting that he was half inclined to address it, without more ado, to Mary herself. His natural instinct to divide his thoughts carefully into two different classes before he expressed them to her prevail addition. But as he watched her looking out of the window and describing the old lady, the woman with the perambulator, the bailiff, and the dissenting minister, his eyes filled involuntarily with tears. He would have liked to lay his head on her shoulder and sob, while she parted his hair with her fingers and soothed him and said, "There, there. Don't cry. Tell me why you're crying, Dash," and they would clasp each other tight, and her arms would hold him like his mother's. He felt that he was very lonely, and that he was afraid of the other people in the room. "How damnable this all is!" he exclaimed abruptly. "What are you talking about?" She replied, rather vaguely, still looking out of the window. He resented this divided attention more than, perhaps, he knew, and he thought how Mary would soon be on her way to America. "Mary," he said, "I want to talk to you." "Haven't we nearly done? Why don't they take away these plates?" Mary felt his agitation without looking at him. She felt convinced that she knew what it was that he wished to say to her. "They'll come all in good time," she said, and felt it necessary to display her extreme calmness by lifting a salt cellar and sweeping up a little heap of breadcrumbs. "I want to apologize," Ralph continued, not quite knowing what he was about to say, but feeling some curious instinct which urged him to commit himself irrevocably, and to prevent the moment of intimacy from passing. "I think I've treated you very badly. That is, I've told you lies. Did you guess that I was lying to you? Once in Lincoln's Inn Fields and again today on our walk. I am a liar, Mary. Did you know that? Do you think you do know me?" "I think I do," she said. At this point the waiter changed their plates. "It's true I don't want you to go to America," he said, looking fixedly at the tablecloth. "In fact, my feelings towards you seem to be utterly and damnably bad," he said energetically, although forced to keep his voice low. If I weren't a selfish beast, I should tell you to have nothing more to do with me. And yet, Mary, in spite of the fact that I believe what I'm saying, I also believe that it's good we should know each other, the world being what it is. You see dash, and by a nod of his head he indicated the other occupants of the room, for, of course, in an ideal state of things, in a decent community even, there's no doubt you shouldn't have anything to do with me seriously, that is. You forget that I'm not an ideal character either, said Mary, in the same low and very earnest tones, which, in spite of being almost inaudible, surrounded their table with an atmosphere of concentration which was quite perceptible to the other diners, who glanced at them now and then with a queer mixture of kindness, amusement, and curiosity. I'm much more selfish than I let on, and I'm worldly a little more than you think, anyhow. I like bossing things, perhaps that's my greatest FAU, Lieutenant. I've none of your passion for dash. Here she hesitated, and glanced at him, as if to ascertain what his passion was for dash. For the truth, she added, as if she had found what she sought indisputably. I've told you I'm a liar, Ralph repeated obstinately. Oh, in little things, I dare say, she said impatiently. But not in real ones, and that's what matters. I dare say I'm more truthful than you're in small ways. But I could never care. She was surprised to find herself speaking the word, and had to force herself to speak it out dash, for anyone who was a liar in that way. I love the truth a certain amount, a considerable amount, but not in the way you love it. Her voice sank, became inaudible, and wavered as if she could scarcely keep herself from tears. Good heavens! Ralph exclaimed to himself. She loves me. Why did I never see it before? She's going to cry, no, but she can't speak. The certainty overwhelmed him so that he scarcely knew what he was doing. The blood rushed to his cheeks. And although he had quite made up his mind to ask her to marry him, the certainty that she loved him seemed to change the situation so completely that he could not do it. He did not dare to look at her. If she cried, he did not know what he should do. It seemed to him that something of a terrible and devastating nature had happened. The waiter changed their plates once more. In his agitation Ralph rose, turned his back upon Mary, and looked out of the window. The people in the street seemed to him only a dissolving and combining pattern of black particles, which, for the moment, represented very well the involuntary procession of feelings and thoughts which formed and dissolved in rapid succession in his own mind. At one moment he exulted in the thought that Mary loved him, at the next, it seemed that he was without feeling for her, her love was repulsive to him. Now he felt urged to marry her at once, now to disappear and never see her again. In order to control this disorderly race of thought he forced himself to read the name on the chemist's shop directly opposite him. Then to examine the objects in the shop windows, and then to focus his eyes exactly upon a little group of women looking in at the great windows of a large draper's shop. This discipline having given him at least a superficial control of himself, he was about to turn and ask the waiter to bring the bill, when his eye was caught by a tall figure walking quickly along the opposite pavement, a tall figure, upright, dark, and commanding, much detached from her surroundings. She held her gloves in her left hand, and the left hand was bare. All this Ralph noticed and enumerated and recognized before he put a name to the whole. Catherine Hilbery. She seemed to be looking for somebody. Her eyes, in fact, scanned both sides of the street, and for 1 second were raised directly to the bow window in which Ralph stood. But she looked away again instantly without giving any sign that she had seen him. This sudden apparition had an extraordinary effect upon him. It was as if he had thought of her so intensely that his mind had formed the shape of her, rather than that he had seen her in the flesh outside in the street. And yet he had not been thinking of her at all. The impression was so intense that he could not dismiss it, nor even think whether he had seen her or merely imagined her. He sat down at once, and said, briefly and strangely, rather to himself than to Mary. That was Catherine Hilbery. Catherine Hilbery? What do you mean? She asked, hardly understanding from his manner whether he had seen her or not. Catherine Hilbery, he repeated, but she's gone now. Catherine Hilbery. Mary thought, in an instant of blinding revelation, I've always known it was Catherine Hilbery. She knew it all now. After a moment of downcast stupor, she raised her eyes, looked steadily at Ralph, and caught his fixed and dreamy gaze leveled at a point far beyond their surroundings. A point that she had never reached in all the time that she had known him. She noticed the lips just parted, the fingers loosely clenched, the whole attitude of rapt contemplation, which fell like a veil between them. She noticed everything about him. If there had been other signs of his utter alienation, she would have sought them out. 2. For she felt that it was only by heaping one truth upon another that she could keep herself sitting there, upright. The truth seemed to support her. It struck her, even as she looked at his face, that the light of truth was shining far away beyond him. The light of truth, she seemed to frame the words as she rose to go, shines on a world not to be shaken by our personal calamities. Ralph handed her coat and her stick. She took them, fastened the coat securely, grasped the stick firmly. The ivy spray was still twisted about the handle. This one sacrifice, she thought, she might make to sentimentality and personality. And she picked 2 leaves from the ivy and put them in her pocket before she disencumbered her stick of the rest of it. She grasped the stick in the middle, and settled her fur cap closely upon her head, as if she must be in trim for a long and stormy walk. Next, standing in the middle of the road, she took a slip of paper from her purse, and read out loud a list of commissions entrusted to her: fruit, butter, string, and so on, and all the time she never spoke directly to Ralph or looked at him. Ralph heard her giving orders to attentive, rosy-cheeked men in white aprons, and in spite of his own preoccupation, he commented upon the determination with which she made her wishes known. Once more he began, automatically, to take stock of her characteristics. Standing thus, superficially observant and stirring the sawdust on the floor meditatively with the toe of his boot, he was roused by a musical and familiar voice behind him, accompanied by a light touch upon his shoulder. I'm not mistaken? Surely, Mr. Denham? I caught a glimpse of your coat through the window, and I felt sure that I knew your coat. Have you seen Catherine or William? I'm wandering about Lincoln looking for the ruins. It was Mrs. Hilbery. Her entrance created some stir in the shop. Many people looked at her. First of all, tell me where I am, she demanded, but, catching sight of the attentive shopman, she appealed to him. The ruins. My party is waiting for me at the ruins. The Roman ruins or Greek, Mr. Denham? Your town has a great many beautiful things in it, but I wish it hadn't so many ruins. I never saw such delightful little pots of honey in my life. Are they made by your own bees? Please give me one of those little pots, and tell me how I shall find my way to the ruins. And now, she continued, having received the information and the pot of honey, having been introduced to Mary, and having insisted that they should accompany her back to the ruins, since in a town with so many turnings, such prospects, such delightful little half-naked boys dabbling in pools, such Venetian canals, such old blue china in the curiosity shops, it was impossible for one person all alone to find her way to the ruins. Now, she exclaimed, please tell me what you're doing here, Mr. Denham, for you are Mr. Denham, aren't you? She inquired, gazing at him with a sudden suspicion of her own accuracy. The brilliant young man who writes for the Review, I mean? Only yesterday my husband was telling me he thought you one of the cleverest young men he knew. Certainly, you've been the messenger of Providence to me, for unless I'd seen you I'm sure I should never have found the ruins at all. They had reached the Roman arch when Mrs. Hilbery caught sight of her own party, standing like sentinels facing up and down the road so as to intercept her if, as they expected, she had got lodged in some shop. "I've found something much better than ruins," she exclaimed. "I've found two friends who told me how to find you, which I could never have done without them. They must come and have tea with us. What a pity that we've just had luncheon. Could they not somehow revoke that meal?" Catherine, who had gone a few steps by herself down the road, and was investigating the window of an ironmonger, as if her mother might have got herself concealed among mowing machines and garden shears, turned sharply on hearing her voice, and came towards them. She was a great deal surprised to see Denham and Mary Datchet. Whether the cordiality with which she greeted them was merely that which is natural to a surprise meeting in the country, or whether she was really glad to see them both, at any rate she exclaimed with unusual pleasure as she shook hands, "I never knew you lived here. Why didn't you say so, and we could have met? And are you staying with Mary?" she continued, turning to Ralph. "What a pity we didn't meet before." Thus confronted at a distance of only a few feet by the real body of the woman about whom he had dreamt so many million dreams, Ralph stammered. He made a clutch at his self-control. The color either came to his cheeks or left them. He knew not which, but he was determined to face her and track down in the cold light of day whatever vestige of truth there might be in his persistent imaginations. He did not succeed in saying anything. It was Mary who spoke for both of them. He was struck dumb by finding that Catherine was quite different, in some strange way, from his memory, so that he had to dismiss his old view in order to accept the new one. The wind was blowing her crimson scarf across her face. The wind had already loosened her hair, which looped across the corner of one of the large, dark eyes which, so he used to think, looked sad. Now they looked bright with the brightness of the sea struck by an unclouded ray. Everything about her seemed rapid, fragmentary, and full of a kind of racing spe. He realized suddenly that he had never seen her in the daylight before. Meanwhile, it was decided that it was too late to go in search of ruins as they had intended, and the whole party began to walk towards the stables where the carriage had been put up. "Do you know," said Catherine, keeping slightly in advance of the rest with Ralph, "I thought I saw you this morning, standing at a window. But I decided that it couldn't be you. And it must have been you all the same." "Yes, I thought I saw you but it wasn't you," he replied. This remark, and the rough strain in his voice, recalled to her memory so many difficult speeches and abortive meetings that she was jerked directly back to the London drawing-room, the family relics, and the tea-table, and at the same time recalled some half-finished or interrupted remark which she had wanted to make herself or to hear from him. She could not remember what it was. "I expect it was me," she said. "I was looking for my mother. It happens every time we come to Lincoln. In fact, there never was a family so unable to take care of itself as ours is. Not that it very much matters, because someone always turns up in the nick of time to help us out of our scrapes. Once I was left in a field with a bull when I was a baby, but where did we leave the carriage? Down that street or the next? The next, I think." She glanced back and saw that the others were following obediently, listening to certain memories of Lincoln upon which Mrs. Hilbery had starred. "But what are you doing here?" "I'm buying a cottage. I'm going to live here as soon as I can find a cottage, and Mary tells me there'll be no difficulty about that." "But," she exclaimed, almost standing still in her surprise, "you will give up the bar, then?" It flashed across her mind that he must already be engaged to Mary. "The solicitor's office?" "Yes. I'm giving that up." "But why?" she asked. She answered herself at once, with a curious change from rapid speech to an almost melancholy tone. I think you're very wise to give it up. You will be much happier. At this very moment, when her words seemed to be striking a path into the future for him, they stepped into the yard of an inn. And there beheld the family coach of the Otways, to which one sleek horse was already attached, while the second was being led out of the stable door by the hostler. I don't know what one means by happiness, he said briefly, having to step aside in order to avoid a groom with a bucket. Why do you think I shall be happy? I don't expect to be anything of the kind. I expect to be rather less unhappy. I shall write a book and curse my charwoman if happiness consists in that. What do you think? She could not answer because they were immediately surrounded by other members of the party by Mrs. Hilbery, and Mary, Henry Otway, and William. Rodney went up to Catherine immediately and said to her, Henry is going to drive home with your mother, and I suggest that they should put us down halfway and let us walk back. Catherine nodded her head. She glanced at him with an oddly furtive expression. Unfortunately, we go in opposite directions, or we might have given you a lift, he continued to Denham. His manner was unusually peremptory, he seemed anxious to hasten the departure, and Catherine looked at him from time to time, as Denham noticed, with an expression half of inquiry, half of annoyance. She at once helped her mother into her cloak, and said to Mary, I want to see you. Are you going back to London at once? I will write. She half smiled at Ralph, but her look was a little overcast by something she was thinking. And in a very few minutes the Otway carriage rolled out of the stable yard and turned down the high road leading to the village of Lampsher. The return drive was almost as silent as the drive from home had been in the morning. Indeed, Mrs. Hilbery leant back with closed eyes in her corner, and either slept or feigned sleep, as her habit was in the intervals between the seasons of active exertion, or continued the story which she had begun to tell herself that morning. About 2 miles from Lampsher the road ran over the rounded summit of the heath, a lonely spot marked by an obelisk of granite, setting forth the gratitude of some great lady of the 18th century who had been set upon by highwaymen at this spot and delivered from death just as hope seemed low. Saint in summer it was a pleasant place, for the deep woods on either side murmured, and the heather, which grew thick round the granite pedestal, made the light breeze taste sweetly. In winter the sighing of the trees was deepened to a hollow sound, and the heath was as grey and almost as solitary as the empty sweep of the clouds above it. Here Rodney stopped the carriage and helped Catherine to alight. Henry, too, gave her his hand, and fancied that she pressed it very slightly in parting as if she sent him a message. But the carriage rolled on immediately, without wakening Mrs. Hilbery, and left the couple standing by the obelisk. That Rodney was angry with her and had made this opportunity for speaking to her, Catherine knew very well. She was neither glad nor sorry that the time had come, nor, indeed, knew what to expect, and thus remained silent. The carriage grew smaller and smaller upon the dusky road, and still Rodney did not speak. Perhaps, she thought, he waited until the last sign of the carriage had disappeared beneath the curve of the road and they were left entirely alone. To cloak their silence she read the writing on the obelisk, to do which she had to walk completely round it. She was murmuring a word to 2 of the pious ladies' thanks above her breath when Rodney joined her. In silence they set out along the cart track which skirted the verge of the trees. To break the silence was exactly what Rodney wished to do, and yet could not do to his own satisfaction. In company it was far easier to approach Catherine. Alone with her, the aloofness and force of her character checked all his natural methods of attack. He believed that she had behaved very badly to him, but each separate instance of unkindness seemed too petty to be advanced when they were alone together. "There's no need for us to race," he complained at last, upon which she immediately slackened her pace, and walked too slowly to suit him. "I've not enjoyed my holiday." No. Number I shall be glad to get back to work again. Saturday, Sunday, Monday there are only 3 days more, she counted. No one enjoys being made a fool of before other people. He blurted out, for his irritation rose as she spoke, and got the better of his awe of her, and was inflamed by that awe. That refers to me, I suppose, she said calmly. Every day since we've been here you've done something to make me appear ridiculous, he went on. Of course, so long as it amuses you, you're welcome, but we have to remember that we are going to spend our lives together. I asked you, only this morning, for example, to come out and take a turn with me in the garden. I was waiting for you 10 minutes, and you never came. Everyone saw me waiting. The stable boys saw me. I was so ashamed that I went in. Then, on the drive you hardly spoke to me. Henry noticed it. Everyone notices it. You find no difficulty in talking to Henry, though. She noted these various complaints and determined philosophically to answer none of them, although the last stung her to considerable irritation. She wished to find out how deep his grievance lay. None of these things seem to me to matter, she said. Very well, then. I may as well hold my tongue, he replied. In themselves they don't seem to me to matter. If they hurt you, of course they matter, she corrected herself scrupulously. Her tone of consideration touched him, and he walked on in silence for a space. And we might be so happy, Catherine, he exclaimed impulsively, and drew her arm through his. She withdrew it directly. As long as you let yourself feel like this we shall never be happy, she said. The harshness, which Henry had noticed, was again unmistakable in her manner. William flinched and was silent. Such severity, accompanied by something indescribably cold and impersonal in her manner, had constantly been meted out to him during the last few days, always in the company of others. He had recouped himself by some ridiculous display of vanity which, as he knew, put him still more at her mercy. Now that he was alone with her there was no stimulus from outside to draw his attention from his injury. By a considerable effort of self-control he forced himself to remain silent, and to make himself distinguish what part of his pain was due to vanity. What part to the certainty that no woman really loving him could speak thus. What do I feel about Catherine? He thought to himself. It was clear that she had been a very desirable and distinguished figure, the mistress of her little section of the world. But more than that, she was the person of all others who seemed to him the arbitress of life, the woman whose judgment was naturally right and steady, as his had never been in spite of all his culture. And then he could not see her come into a room without a sense of the flowing of robes, of the flowering of blossoms, of the purple waves of the sea, of all things that are lovely and mutable on the surface but still and passionate in their heart. If she were callous all the time and had only led me on to laugh at me I couldn't have felt that about her, he thought. I'm not a fool, after all. I can't have been utterly mistaken all these years. And yet, when she speaks to me like that. The truth of it is, he thought, that I've got such despicable faults that no one could help speaking to me like that. Catherine is quite right. And yet those are not my serious feelings, as she knows quite well. How can I change myself? What would make her care for me? He was terribly tempted here to break the silence by asking Catherine in what respects he could change himself to suit her. But he sought consolation instead by running over the list of his gifts and acquirements, his knowledge of Greek and Latin, his knowledge of art and literature, his skill in the management of meters, and his ancient West Country blood. But the feeling that underlay all these feelings and puzzled him profoundly and kept him silent was the certainty that he loved Catherine as sincerely as he had it in him to love anyone. And yet she could speak to him like that. In a sort of bewilderment he lost all desire to speak, and would quite readily have taken up some different topic of conversation if Catherine had started one. This, however, she did not do. He glanced at her, in case her expression might help him to understand her behavior. As usual, she had quickened her pace unconsciously, and was now walking a little in front of him, but he could gain little information from her eyes, which looked steadily at the brown heather, or from the lines drawn seriously upon her forehead. Thus to lose touch with her, for he had no idea what she was thinking, was so unpleasant to him that he began to talk about his grievances again, without, however, much conviction in his voice. "If you have no feeling for me, wouldn't it be kinder to say so to me in private?" "Oh, William," she burst out, as if he had interrupted some absorbing train of thought, "how you go on about feelings. Isn't it better not to talk so much, not to be worrying always about small things that don't really matter?" "That's the question precisely," he exclaimed. Addition, "I only want you to tell me that they don't matter. There are times when you seem indifferent to everything. I'm vain, I've 1,000 faults, but you know they're not everything. You know I care for you. And if I say that I care for you, don't you believe me? Say it, Catherine. Say it as if you meant it. Make me feel that you care for me." She could not force herself to speak a word. The heather was growing dim around them, and the horizon was blotted out by white mist. To ask her for passion or for certainty seemed like asking that damp prospect for fierce blades of fire, or the faded sky for the intense blue vault of June. He went on now to tell her of his love for her, in words which bore, even to her critical senses, the stamp of truth. But none of this touched her, until, coming to a gate whose hinge was rusty, he heaved it open with his shoulder, still talking and taking no account of his effort. The virility of this deed impressed her, and yet, normally, she attached no value to the power of opening gates. The strength of muscles has nothing to do on the face of it with the strength of affections, nevertheless. She felt a sudden concern for this power running to waste on her account, which, combined with a desire to keep possession of that strangely attractive masculine power, made her rouse herself from her torpor. Why should she not simply tell him the truth, which was that she had accepted him in a misty state of mind when nothing had its right shape or size? That it was deplorable, but that with clearer eyesight marriage was out of the question? She did not want to marry anyone. She wanted to go away by herself, preferably to some bleak northern moor, and there study mathematics and the science of astronomy. 20 words would explain the whole situation to him. He had ceased to speak. He had told her once more how he loved her and why. She summoned her courage, fixed her eyes upon a lightning-splintered ash tree, and, almost as if she were reading a writing fixed to the trunk, began. "I was wrong to get engaged to you. I shall never make you happy. I have never loved you, Catherine." He protested. "No, never," she repeated obstinately. "Not rightly. Don't you see, I didn't know what I was doing? You love someone else?" He cut her short. "Absolutely no one." "Henry?" he demanded. "Henry? There is someone," he persisted. "There has been a change in the last few weeks. You owe it to me to be honest, Catherine." "If I could, I would," she replied. "Why did you tell me you would marry me, then?" "Why, indeed?" A moment of pessimism, a sudden conviction of the undeniable prose of life, a lapse of the illusion which sustains youth midway between heaven and earth. A desperate attempt to reconcile herself with facts she could only recall a moment, as of waking from a dream, which now seemed to her a moment of surrender. But who could give reasons such as these for doing what she had done? She shook her head very sadly. "But you're not a child, you're not a woman of moods," Rodney persisted. "You couldn't have accepted me if you hadn't loved me." A sense of her own misbehavior, which she had succeeded in keeping from her by sharpening her consciousness of Rodney's faults, now swept over her and almost overwhelmed her. What were his faults in comparison with the fact that he cared for her? What were her virtues in comparison with the fact that she did not care for him? In a flash, the conviction that not to care is the uttermost sin of all stamped itself upon her inmost thought, and she felt herself branded forever. He had taken her arm and held her hand firmly in his, nor had she the force to resist what now seemed to her his enormously superior strength. Very well, she would submit, as her mother and her aunt and most women, perhaps, had submitted, and yet she knew that every second of such submission to his strength was a second of treachery to him. "I did say I would marry you, but it was wrong," she forced herself to say, and she stiffened her arm as if to annul even the seeming submission of that separate part of her. "For I don't love you, William, you've noticed it, everyone's noticed it, why should we go on pretending? When I told you I loved you, I was wrong. I said what I knew to be untrue." As none of her words seemed to her at all adequate to represent what she felt, she repeated them, and emphasized them without realizing the effect that they might have upon a man who cared for her. She was completely taken aback by finding her arm suddenly dropped, then she saw his face most strangely contorted. Was he laughing? It flashed across her. In another moment she saw that he was in tears. In her bewilderment at this apparition she stood aghast for a second. With a desperate sense that this horror must, at all costs, be stopped, she then put her arms about him, drew his head for a moment upon her shoulder, and led him on, murmuring words of consolation, until he heaved a great sigh. They held fast to each other, her tears, too, ran down her cheeks, and were both quite silent. Noticing the difficulty with which he walked, and feeling the same extreme lassitude in her own limbs, she proposed that they should rest for a moment where the bracken was brown and shriveled beneath an oak tree. He assented. Once more he gave a great sigh, and wiped his eyes with a childlike unconsciousness, and began to speak without a trace of his previous anger. The idea came to her that they were like the children in the fairy tale who were lost in a wood. And with this in her mind she noticed the scattering of dead leaves all round them which had been blown by the wind into heaps, a foot or two deep, here and there. "When did you begin to feel this, Catherine?" he said, "for it isn't true to say that you've always felt it. I admit I was unreasonable the first night when you found that your clothes had been left behind. Still, where's the fault in that? I could promise you never to interfere with your clothes again. I admit I was cross when I found you upstairs with Henry. Perhaps I showed it too openly. But that's not unreasonable either when one's in Gagadition. Ask your mother. And now this terrible thing he broke off, unable for the moment to proceed any further. This decision you say you've come to, have you discussed it with anyone? Your mother, for example, or Henry?" No, of course not," she said, stirring the leaves with her hand. "Help me to understand you. You don't understand, I mean, my real feelings, how could you? I've only now faced them myself." "How a farce!" he asked. "But this kind of analysis is disastrous." "I should have done it before," she said gloomily. "You make yourself think things you don't think," he continued, becoming demonstrative with his hands, as his manner was. "Believe me, Catherine, before we came here we were perfectly happy. You were full of plans for our house, the chair covers, don't you remember? Like any other woman who is about to be married now, for no reason whatever, you begin to fret about your feeling and about my feeling. With the usual Lieutenant, I assure you, Catherine, I've been through it all myself. At one time I was always asking myself absurd questions which came to nothing either. What you want, if I may say so, is some occupation to take you out of yourself when this morbid mood comes on. If it hadn't been for my poetry, I assure you, I should often have been very much in the same state myself. To let you into a secret, he continued, with his little chuckle, which now sounded almost assured. I've often gone home from seeing you in such a state of nerves that I had to force myself to write a page or two before I could get you out of my head. Ask Denham, he'll tell you how he met me one night, he'll tell you what a state he found me in. Catherine started with displeasure at the mention of Ralph's name. The thought of the conversation in which her conduct had been made a subject for discussion with Denham roused her anger. But, as she instantly felt, she had scarcely the right to grudge William any use of her name, seeing what her fault against him had been from first to Lassaint and yet Denham. She had a view of him as a judge. She figured him sternly weighing instances of her levity in this masculine court of inquiry into feminine morality and gruffly dismissing both her and her family with some half-sarcastic, half-tolerant phrase which sealed her doom, as far as he was concerned, forever. Having met him so lately, the sense of his character was strong in her. The thought was not a pleasant one for a proud woman, but she had yet to learn the art of subduing her expression. Her eyes fixed upon the ground, her brows drawn together, gave William a very fair picture of the resentment that she was forcing herself to control. A certain degree of apprehension, occasionally culminating in a kind of fear, had always entered into his love for her, and had increased, rather to his surprise, in the greater intimacy of their engagement. Beneath her steady, exemplary surface ran a vein of passion which seemed to him now perverse, now completely irrational. For it never took the normal channel of glorification of him and his doings, and, indeed, he almost preferred the steady good sense which had always marked their relationship, to a more romantic bond. But passion she had, he could not deny it, and hitherto he had tried to see it employed in his thoughts upon the lives of the children who were to be born to them. She will make a perfect mother, a mother of sons, he thought, but seeing her sitting there, gloomy and silent, he began to have his doubts on this point. A farce, he thought to himself. She said that our marriage would be a farce, and he became suddenly aware of their situation, sitting upon the ground, among the dead leaves, not 50 yards from the main road, so that it was quite possible for some one passing to see and recognize them. He brushed off his face any trace that might remain of that unseemly exhibition of emotion. But he was more troubled by Catherine's appearance, as she sat wrapped in thought upon the ground, than by his own. There was something improper to him in her self-forgetfulness. A man naturally alive to the conventions of society, he was strictly conventional where women were concerned, and especially if the women happened to be in any way connected with him. He noticed with distress the long strand of dark hair touching her shoulder and 2 or 3 dead beech leaves attached to her dress. But to recall her mind in their present circumstances to a sense of these details was impossible. She sat there, seeming unconscious of everything. He suspected that in her silence she was reproaching herself, but he wished that she would think of her hair and of the dead beech leaves, which were of more immediate importance to him than anything else. Indeed, these trifles drew his attention strangely from his own doubtful and uneasy state of mind, for relief, mixing itself with pain, stirred up a most curious hurry and tumult in his breast, almost concealing his first sharp sense of bleak and overwhelming disappointment. In order to relieve this restlessness and close a distressingly ill-ordered scene, he rose abruptly and helped Catherine to her feet. She smiled a little at the minute care with which he tidied her, and yet, when he brushed the dead leaves from his own coat, she flinched, seeing in that action the gesture of a lonely man. "William," she said, "I will marry you. I will try to make you happy." Chapter 19. The afternoon was already growing dark when the 2 other wayfarers, Mary and Ralph Denham, came out on the high road beyond the outskirts of Lincoln. The high road, as they both felt, was better suited to this return journey than the open country, and for the first mile or so of the way they spoke little. In his own mind Ralph was following the passage of the Otway carriage over the heath. He then went back to the 5 or 10 minutes that he had spent with Catherine, and examined each word with the care that a scholar displays upon the irregularities of an ancient text. He was determined that the glow, the romance, the atmosphere of this meeting should not paint what he must in future regard as sober facts. On her side Mary was silent, not because her thoughts took much handling, but because her mind seemed empty of thought as her heart of feeling. Only Ralph's presence, as she knew, preserved this numbness, for she could foresee a time of loneliness when many varieties of pain would beset her. At the present moment her effort was to preserve what she could of the wreck of her self-respect, for such she deemed that momentary glimpse of her love so involuntarily revealed to Ralph. In the light of reason it did not much matter, perhaps, but it was her instinct to be careful of that vision of herself which keeps pace so evenly beside every one of us, and had been damaged by her confession. The grey night coming down over the country was kind to her, and she thought that one of these days she would find comfort in sitting upon the earth, alone, beneath a tree. Looking through the darkness, she marked the swelling ground and the tree. What I was going to say when we were interrupted at lunch was that if you go to America I shall come, too. It can't be harder to earn a living there than it is here. However, that's not the point. The point is, Mary, that I want to marry you. Well, what do you say? He spoke firmly, waited for no answer, and took her arm in his. You know me by this time, the good and the bad, he went on. You know my tempers. I've tried to let you know my faults. Well, what do you say, Mary? She said nothing, but this did not seem to strike him. In most ways, at least in the important ways, as you said, we know each other and we think alike. I believe you are the only person in the world I could live with happily. And if you feel the same about me as you do, don't you, Mary? We should make each other happy. Here he paused, and seemed to be in no hurry for an answer. He seemed, indeed, to be continuing his own thoughts. Yes, but I'm afraid I couldn't do it, Mary said at last, the casual and rather hurried way in which she spoke, together with the fact that she was saying the exact opposite of what he expected her to say, baffled him so much that he instinctively loosened his clasp upon her arm and she withdrew it quietly. You couldn't do it? He asked. Addition, no, I couldn't marry you, she replied. Addition, you don't care for me? She made no answer. Well, Mary, he said, with a curious laugh, I must be an arrant fool, for I thought you did. They walked for a minute or two in silence, and suddenly he turned to her, looked at her, and exclaimed, I don't believe you, Mary. You're not telling me the truth. I'm too tired to argue, Ralph, she replied, turning her head away from him. I ask you to believe what I say. I can't marry you. I don't want to marry you. The voice in which she stated this was so evidently the voice of one in some extremity of anguish that Ralph had no course but to obey her. And as soon as the tone of her voice had died out, and the surprise faded from his mind, he found himself believing that she had spoken the truth. For he had but little vanity, and soon her refusal seemed a natural thing to him. He slipped through all the grades of despondency until he reached a bottom of absolute gloom. Failure seemed to mark the whole of his life. He had failed with Catherine, and now he had failed with Mary. Up at once sprang the thought of Catherine, and with it a sense of exulting freedom, but this he checked instantly. Haven't I always been thinking of Catherine while I was with Mary? I might have loved Mary if it hadn't been for that idiocy of mine. She cared for me once, I'm certain of that, but I tormented her so with my humors that I let my chances slip, and now she won't risk marrying me. And this is what I've made of my life. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The tramp of their boots upon the dry road seemed to asseverate nothing, nothing, nothing. Mary thought that this silence was the silence of relief. His depression she ascribed to the fact that he had seen Catherine and parted from her, leaving her in the company of William Rodney. She could not blame him for loving Catherine, but that, when he loved another, he should ask her to marry him, that seemed to her the cruelest treachery. Their old friendship and its firm base upon indestructible qualities of character crumbled, and her whole past seemed foolish, herself weak and credulous, and Ralph merely the shell of an honest man. Oh, the past so much made up of Ralph, and now, as she saw, made up of something strange and false and other than she had thought it. She tried to recapture a saying she had made to help herself that morning, as Ralph paid the bill for luncheon, but she could see him paying the bill more vividly than she could remember the phrase. Something about truth was in it. How to see the truth is our great chance in this world. If you don't want to marry me, Ralph now began again, without abruptness, with diffidence rather, there is no need why we should cease to see each other, is there? Or would you rather that we should keep apart for the present? Keep apart? I don't know, I must think about it. Tell me one thing, Mary, he resumed, have I done anything to make you change your mind about me? She was immensely tempted to give way to her natural trust in him, revived by the deep and now melancholy tones of his voice, and to tell him of her love, and of what had changed it. But although it seemed likely that she would soon control her anger with him, the certainty that he did not love her, confirmed by every word of his proposal, forbade any freedom of speech. To hear him speak and to feel herself unable to reply, or constrained in her replies, was so painful that she longed for the time when she should be alone. A more pliant woman would have taken this chance of an explanation, whatever risks attached to it. But to one of Mary's firm and resolute temperament there was degradation in the idea of self-abandonment. Let the waves of emotion rise ever so high, she could not shut her eyes to what she conceived to be the truth. Her silence puzzled Ralph. He searched his memory for words or deeds that might have made her think badly of him. You needn't answer, he said grimly. There are reasons enough, I know. But must they kill our friendship, Mary? Oh, she thought to herself, with a sudden rush of anguish which threatened disaster to her self-respect, it has come to this when I could have given him everything. Yes, we can still be friends, she said, with what firmness she could muster. I shall want your friendship, he said. He added, if you find it possible, let me see you as often as you can. The oftener the better. I shall want your help. She promised this, and they went on to talk calmly of things that had no reference to their feelings, a talk which, in its constraint, was infinitely sad to both of them. One more reference was made to the state of things between them late that night, when Elizabeth had gone to her room. And the two young men had stumbled off to bed in such a state of sleep that they hardly felt the floor beneath their feet after a day's shooting. Mary drew her chair a little nearer to the fire, for the logs were burning low, and at this time of night it was hardly worth while to replenish them. Ralph was reading, but she had noticed for some time that his eyes, instead of following the print, were fixed rather above the page with an intensity of gloom that came to weigh upon her mind. She had not weakened in her resolve not to give way, for reflection had only made her more bitterly certain that, if she gave way, it would be to her own wish and not to his. But she had determined that there was no reason why he should suffer if her reticence were the cause of his suffering. Therefore, although she found it painful, she spoke. You asked me if I had changed my mind about you, Ralph, she said. I think there's only one thing. When you asked me to marry you, I don't think you meant it. That made me angry for the moment. Before, you'd always spoken the truth. Ralph's book slid down upon his knee and fell upon the floor. He rested his forehead on his hand and looked into the fire. He was trying to recall the exact words in which he had made his proposal to Mary. I never said I loved you, he said at Saint. She winced, but she respected him for saying what he did, for this, after all, was a fragment of the truth which she had vowed to live by. "And to me marriage without love doesn't seem worthwhile," she said. "Well, Mary, I'm not going to press you," he said. "I see you don't want to marry me. But love, don't we all talk a great deal of nonsense about it? What does one mean? I believe I care for you more genuinely than 9 men out of 10 care for the women they're in love with. It's only a story one makes up in one's mind about another person, and one knows all the time it isn't true. Of course one knows. Why, one's always taking care not to destroy the illusion. One takes care not to see them too often, or to be alone with them for too long together. It's a pleasant illusion, but if you're thinking of the risks of marriage, it seems to me that the risk of marrying a person you're in love with is something colossal." "I don't believe a word of that, and what's more you don't either," she replied with anger. "However, we don't agree. I only wanted you to understand." She shifted her position, as if she were about to go. An instinctive desire to prevent her from leaving the room made Ralph rise at this point and begin pacing up and down the nearly empty kitchen, checking his desire, each time he reached the door, to open it and step out into the garden. A moralist might have said that at this point his mind should have been full of self-reproach for the suffering he had caused. On the contrary, he was extremely angry, with the confused, impotent anger of one who finds himself unreasonably but efficiently frustrated. He was trapped by the illogicality of human life. The obstacles in the way of his desire seemed to him purely artificial, and yet he could see no way of removing them. Mary's words, the tone of her voice even, angered him, for she would not help him. She was part of the insanely jumbled muddle of a world which impedes the sensible life. He would have liked to slam the door or break the hind legs of a chair, for the obstacles had taken some such curiously substantial shape in his mind. "I doubt that one human being ever understands another," he said, stopping in his march and confronting Mary at a distance of a few feet. "Such damned liars as we all are, how can we? But we can try. If you don't want to marry me, don't, but the position you take up about love and not seeing each other, isn't that mere sentimentality? You think I've behaved very badly," he continued, as she did not speak. "Of course I behave badly, but you can't judge people by what they do. You can't go through life measuring right and wrong with a foot rule. That's what you're always doing, Mary, that's what you're doing now." She saw herself in the suffrage office, delivering judgment, meting out right and wrong, and there seemed to her to be some justice in the charge, although it did not affect her main position. "I'm not angry with you," she said slowly. "I will go on seeing you, as I said I would." It was true that she had promised that much already, and it was difficult for him to say what more it was that he wanted. Some intimacy, some help against the ghost of Catherine, perhaps, something that he knew he had no right to ask, and yet. As he sank into his chair and looked once more at the dying fire, it seemed to him that he had been defeated. Not so much by Mary as by life itself. He felt himself thrown back to the beginning of life again, where everything has yet to be won, but in extreme youth one has an ignorant hope. He was no longer certain that he would triumph. Chapter 20. Happily for Mary Datchet, she returned to the office to find that by some obscure parliamentary maneuver the vote had once more slipped beyond the attainment of women. Mrs. Seal was in a condition bordering upon frenzy. The duplicity of ministers, the treachery of mankind, the insult to womanhood, the setback to civilization, the ruin of her life's work, the feelings of her father's daughter, all these topics were discussed in turn. And the office was littered with newspaper cuttings branded with the blue, if ambiguous, marks of her displeasure. She confessed herself at fault in her estimate of human nature. "The simple elementary acts of justice," she said, waving her hand towards the window, and indicating the foot passengers and omnibuses then passing down the far side of Russell Square, are as far beyond them as they ever were. We can only look upon ourselves, Mary, as pioneers in a wilderness. We can only go on patiently putting the truth before them. It isn't them, she continued, taking heart from her side of the traffic, it's their leaders. It's those gentlemen sitting in Parliament and drawing 400 a year of the people's money. If we had to put our case to the people, we should soon have justice done to us. I have always believed in the people, and I do so still. But she shook her head and implied that she would give them one more chance, and if they didn't take advantage of that she couldn't answer for the consequences. Mr. Clacton's attitude was more philosophical and better supported by statistics. He came into the room after Mrs. Seal's outburst and pointed out, with historical illustrations, that such reverses had happened in every political campaign of any importance. If anything, his spirits were improved by the disaster. The enemy, he said, had taken the offensive, and it was now up to the society to outwit the enemy. He gave Mary to understand that he had taken the measure of their cunning, and had already bent his mind to the task which, so far as she could make out, depended solely upon him. It depended, so she came to think, when invited into his room for a private conference, upon a systematic revision of the card index. Upon the issue of certain new lemon-colored leaflets, in which the facts were marshaled once more in a very striking way. And upon a large-scale map of England dotted with little pins tufted with differently colored plumes of hair according to their geographical position. Each district, under the new system, had its flag, its bottle of ink, its sheaf of documents tabulated and filed for reference in a drawer. So that by looking under M or S, as the case might be, you had all the facts with respect to the suffrage organizations of that county at your fingers' ends. This would require a great deal of work, of course. We must try to consider ourselves rather in the light of a telephone exchange for the exchange of ideas, Miss Datchet, he said, and taking pleasure in his image, he continued it. We should consider ourselves the center of an enormous system of wires, connecting us up with every district of the country. We must have our fingers upon the pulse of the community. We want to know what people all over England are thinking. We want to put them in the way of thinking rightly. The system, of course, was only roughly sketched, so far jotted down, in fact, during the Christmas holidays. When you ought to have been taking a rest, Mr. Clacton, said Mary dutifully, but her tone was flat and tear-edition. We learn to do without holidays, Miss Datchet, said Mr. Clacton, with a spark of satisfaction in his eye. He wished particularly to have her opinion of the lemon-colored leaflet. According to his plan, it was to be distributed in immense quantities immediately, in order to stimulate and generate. To generate and stimulate, he repeated, right thoughts in the country before the meeting of Parliament. We have to take the enemy by surprise, he said. They don't let the grass grow under their feet. Have you seen Bingham's address to his constituents? That's a hint of the sort of thing we've got to meet, Miss Datchet. He handed her a great bundle of newspaper cuttings, and, begging her to give him her views upon the yellow leaflet before lunchtime, he turned with alacrity to his different sheets of paper and his different bottles of ink. Mary shut the door, laid the documents upon her table, and sank her head on her hands. Her brain was curiously empty of any thought. She listened, as if, perhaps, by listening she would become merged again in the atmosphere of the office. From the next room came the rapid spasmodic sounds of Mrs. Seal's erratic typewriting. She, doubtless, was already hard at work helping the people of England, as Mr. Clacton put it, to think rightly. Generating and stimulating, those were his words. She was striking a blow against the enemy, no doubt, who didn't let the grass grow beneath their feet. Mr. Clacton's words repeated themselves accurately in her brain. She pushed the papers wearily over to the farther side of the table. It was no use, though. Something or other had happened to her brain, a change of focus so that near things were indistinct again. The same thing had happened to her once before, she remembered, after she had met Ralph in the gardens of Lincoln's Inn Fields. She had spent the whole of a committee meeting in thinking about sparrows and colors, until, almost at the end of the meeting, her old convictions had all come back to her. But they had only come back, she thought with scorn at her feebleness, because she wanted to use them to fight against Ralph. They weren't, rightly speaking, convictions at all. She could not see the world divided into separate compartments of good people and bad people, any more than she could believe so implicitly in the rightness of her own thought as to wish to bring the population of the British Isles into agreement with it. She looked at the lemon-colored leaflet, and thought almost enviously of the faith which could find comfort in the issue of such documents. For herself, she would be content to remain silent forever if a share of personal happiness were granted her. She read Mr. Clacton's statement with a curious division of judgment, noting its weak and pompous verbosity on the one hand, and, at the same time, feeling that faith in an illusion, perhaps, but, at any rate, faith in something, was of all gifts the most to be envied. An illusion it was, no doubt. She looked curiously round her at the furniture of the office, at the machinery in which she had taken so much pride, and marveled to think that once the copying presses, the card index, the files of documents, had all been shrouded, wrapped in some mist which gave them a unity and a general dignity and purpose independently of their separate significance. The ugly cumbersomeness of the furniture alone impressed her now. Her attitude had become very lax and despondent when the typewriter stopped in the next room. Mary immediately drew up to the table, laid hands on an unopened envelope, and adopted an expression which might hide her state of mind from Mrs. Seal. Some instinct of decency required that she should not allow Mrs. Seal to see her face. Shading her eyes with her fingers, she watched Mrs. Seal pull out one drawer after another in her search for some envelope or leaflet. She was tempted to drop her fingers and exclaim, "Do sit down, Sally, and tell me how you manage it, how you manage." That is, to bustle about with perfect confidence in the necessity of your own activities, which to me seem as futile as the buzzing of a belated bluebottle. She said nothing of the kind, however, and the presence of industry which she preserved so long as Mrs. Seal was in the room served to set her brain in motion, so that she dispatched her morning's work much as usual. At 1 o'clock she was surprised to find how efficiently she had dealt with the morning. As she put her hat on, she determined to lunch at a shop in the Strand, so as to set that other piece of mechanism, her body, into action. With a brain working and a body working, one could keep step with the crowd and never be found out for the hollow machine, lacking the essential thing, that one was conscious of being. She considered her case as she walked down the Charing Cross Road. She put to herself a series of questions. Would she mind, for example, if the wheels of that motor omnibus passed over her and crushed her to death? No, not in the least. Or an adventure with that disagreeable-looking man hanging about the entrance of the tube station? No, she could not conceive fear or excitement. Did suffering in any form appall her? No, suffering was neither good nor bad. And this essential thing? In the eyes of every single person she detected a flame, as if a spark in the brain ignited spontaneously at contact with the things they met and drove them on. The young women looking into the milliners' windows had that look in their eyes, and elderly men turning over books in the second-hand bookshops, and eagerly waiting to hear what the price was, the very lowest price they had it, too. But she cared nothing at all for clothes or for money either. Books she shrank from, for they were connected too closely with Ralph. She kept on her way resolutely through the crowd of people, among whom she was so much of an alien, feeling them cleave and give way before her. Strange thoughts are bred in passing through crowded streets should the passenger, by chance, have no exact destination in front of him. Much as the mind shapes all kinds of forms, solutions, images when listening inattentively to music. From an acute consciousness of herself as an individual, Mary passed to a conception of the scheme of things in which, as a human being, she must have her share. She half held a vision. The vision-shaped and dwindled edition. She wished she had a pencil and a piece of paper to help her to give a form to this conception which composed itself as she walked down the Charing Cross Road. But if she talked to anyone, the conception might escape her. Her vision seemed to lay out the lines of her life until death in a way which satisfied her sense of harmony. It only needed a persistent effort of thought, stimulated in this strange way by the crowd and the noise, to climb the crest of existence and see it all laid out once and forever. Already her suffering as an individual was left behind her. Of this process, which was to her so full of effort, which comprised infinitely swift and full passages of thought, leading from one crest to another, as she shaped her conception of life in this world, only two articulate words escaped her. Muttered beneath her breath, "Not happiness, not happiness." She sat down on a seat opposite the statue of one of London's heroes upon the Embankment, and spoke the words aloud. To her they represented the rare flower or splinter of rock brought down by a climber in proof that he has stood for a moment, at least, upon the highest peak of the mountain. She had been up there and seen the world spread to the horizon. It was now necessary to alter her course to some extent, according to her new resolve. Her post should be in one of those exposed and desolate stations which are shunned naturally by happy people. She arranged the details of the new plan in her mind, not without a grim satisfaction. Now, she said to herself, rising from her seat, I'll think of Ralph. Where was he to be placed in the new scale of life? Her exalted mood seemed to make it safe to handle the question. But she was dismayed to find how quickly her passions leapt forward the moment she sanctioned this line of thought. Now she was identified with him and rethought his thoughts with complete self-surrender. Now, with a sudden cleavage of spirit, she turned upon him and denounced him for his cruelty. But I refuse to hate anyone, she said aloud, chose the moment to cross the road with circumspection. And 10 minutes later lunched in the Strand, cutting her meat firmly into small pieces, but giving her fellow diners no further cause to judge her eccentric. Her soliloquy crystallized itself into little fragmentary phrases emerging suddenly from the turbulence of her thought. Particularly when she had to exert herself in any way, either to move, to count money, or to choose a turning. To know the truth, to accept without bitterness, those, perhaps, were the most articulate of her utterances. For no one could have made head or tail of the queer gibberish murmured in front of the statue of Francis, Duke of Bedford, save that the name of Ralph occurred frequently in very strange connections, as if, having spoken it, she wished, superstitiously, to cancel it by adding some other word that robbed the sentence with his name in it of any meaning. Those champions of the cause of women, Mr. Clacton and Mrs. Seal, did not perceive anything strange in Mary's behavior, save that she was almost half an hour later than usual in coming back to the office. Happily, their own affairs kept them busy, and she was free from their inspection. If they had surprised her, they would have found her lost, apparently, in admiration of the large hotel across the square. For, after writing a few words, her pen rested upon the paper, and her mind pursued its own journey among the sun-blazoned windows and the drifts of purplish smoke which formed her view. And, indeed, this background was by no means out of keeping with her thoughts. She saw to the remote spaces behind the strife of the foreground, enabled now to gaze there, since she had renounced her own demands. Privileged to see the larger view, to share the vast desires and sufferings of the mass of mankind. She had been too lately and too roughly mastered by facts to take an easy pleasure in the relief of renunciation. Such satisfaction as she felt came only from the discovery that, having renounced everything that made life happy, easy, splendid, individual, there remained a hard reality, unimpaired by one's personal adventures, remote as the stars, unquenchable as they are. While Mary Datchet was undergoing this curious transformation from the particular to the universal, Mrs. Seal remembered her duties with regard to the kettle and the gas fire. She was a little surprised to find that Mary had drawn her chair to the window, and, having lit the gas, she raised herself from a stooping posture and looked at her. The most obvious reason for such an attitude in a secretary was some kind of indisposition. "I'm frightfully lazy this afternoon," she added, with a glance at her table. "You must really get another secretary, Sally." The words were meant to be taken lightly, but something in the tone of them roused a jealous fear which was always dormant in Mrs. Seal's Brea Saint. She was terribly afraid that one of these days Mary, the young woman who typified so many rather sentimental and enthusiastic ideas, who had some sort of visionary existence in white with a sheaf of lilies in her hand, would announce, in a jaunty way, that she was about to be Mary Edition. "You don't mean that you're going to leave us?" she said. "I've not made up my mind about anything," said Mary, a remark which could be taken as a generalization. Mrs. Seal got the teacups out of the cupboard and set them on the table. "You're not going to be married, are you? Why are you asking such absurd questions this afternoon, Sally?" Mary asked, not very steadily. "Must we all get married?" Mrs. Seal emitted a most peculiar chuckle. She seemed for one moment to acknowledge the terrible side of life which is concerned with the emotions, the private lives, of the sexes, and then to sheer off from it with all possible speed into the shades of her own shivering virginity. She was made so uncomfortable by the turn the conversation had taken, that she plunged her head into the cupboard, and endeavored to abstract some very obscure piece of china. "We have our work," she said, withdrawing her head, displaying cheeks more than usually crimson, and placing a jam-pot emphatically upon the table. But, for the moment, she was unable to launch herself upon one of those enthusiastic, but inconsequent, tirades upon liberty, democracy, the rights of the people, and the iniquities of the government, in which she delighted. Addition some memory from her own past or from the past of her sex rose to her mind and kept her abashed. Addition she glanced furtively at Mary, who still sat by the window with her arm upon the sill. She noticed how young she was and full of the promise of womanhood. The sight made her so uneasy that she fidgeted the cups upon their saucers. "Yes, enough work to last a lifetime," said Mary, as if concluding some passage of thought. Mrs. Seal brightened at once. She lamented her lack of scientific training, and her deficiency in the processes of logic. But she set her mind to work at once to make the prospects of the cause appear as alluring and important as she could. She delivered herself of an harangue in which she asked a great many rhetorical questions and answered them with a little bang of one fist upon another. "To last a lifetime? My dear child, it will last all our lifetimes. As one falls another steps into the breach. My father, in his generation, a pioneer, I, coming after him, do my little be established. What, alas, can one do more? And now it's you young women, we look to you, the future looks to you. Ah, my dear, if I'd 1,000 lives, I'd give them all to our cause." "The cause of women, d'you say?" "I say the cause of humanity. And there are some," she glanced fiercely at the window dash, "who don't see it. There are some who are satisfied to go on, year after year, refusing to admit the truth. And we who have the vision, the kettle boiling over. No, no, let me see to it, we who know the truth," she continued, gesticulating with the kettle and the teapot. Owing to these encumbrances, perhaps, she lost the thread of her discourse, and concluded, rather wistfully, "It's all so simple." She referred to a matter that was a perpetual source of bewilderment to her, the extraordinary incapacity of the human race. In a world where the good is so unmistakably divided from the bad, of distinguishing one from the other, and embodying what ought to be done in a few large, simple acts of Parliament, which would, in a very short time, completely change the lot of humanity. One would have thought, she said, that men of university training, like Mr. Asquith, one would have thought that an appeal to reason would not be unheard by them. But reason, she reflected, what is reason without reality? Doing homage to the phrase, she repeated it once more, and caught the ear of Mr. Clacton, as he issued from his room. And he repeated it a third time, giving it, as he was in the habit of doing with Mrs. Seal's phrases, a dryly humorous intonation. He was well pleased with the world, however, and he remarked, in a flattering manner, that he would like to see that phrase in large letters at the head of a leaflet. "But, Mrs. Seal, we have to aim at a judicious combination of the two," he added in his magisterial way to check the unbalanced enthusiasm of the women. "Reality has to be voiced by reason before it can make itself felt." Lieutenant, the weak point of all these movements. Miss Datchet, he continued, taking his place at the table and turning to Mary as usual when about to deliver his more profound cogitations, is that they are not based upon sufficiently intellectual grounds. A mistake, in my opinion. The British public likes a pellet of reason in its jam of eloquence, a pill of reason in its pudding of sentiment, he said, sharpening the phrase to a satisfactory degree of literary precision. His eyes rested, with something of the vanity of an author, upon the yellow leaflet which Mary held in her hand. She rose, took her seat at the head of the table, poured out tea for her colleagues, and gave her opinion upon the leaflet. So she had poured out tea, so she had criticized Mr. Clacton's leaflets 100 times already, but now it seemed to her that she was doing it in a different spirit. She had enlisted in the army, and was a volunteer no longer. She had renounced something and was now, how could she express it? Not quite, in the running, for life. She had always known that Mr. Clacton and Mrs. Seal were not in the running, and across the gulf that separated them she had seen them in the guise of shadow people, flitting in and out of the ranks of the living eccentrics, undeveloped human beings, from whose substance some essential part had been cut away. All this had never struck her so clearly as it did this afternoon, when she felt that her lot was cast with them forever. One view of the world plunged in darkness, so a more volatile temperament might have argued after a season of despair, let the world turn again and show another, more splendid, perhaps. No, Mary thought, with unflinching loyalty to what appeared to her to be the true view, having lost what is best, I do not mean to pretend that any other view does instead. Whatever happens, I mean to have no presences in my life. Her very words had a sort of distinctness which is sometimes produced by sharp, bodily pain. To Mrs. Seal's secret jubilation, the rule which forbade discussion of shop at tea time was overlooked. Mary and Mr. Clacton argued with a cogency and a ferocity which made the little woman feel that something very important, she hardly knew what was taking place. She became much excited, one crucifix became entangled with another, and she dug a considerable hole in the table with the point of her pencil in order to emphasize the most striking heads of the discourse. And how any combination of cabinet ministers could resist such discourse she really did not know. She could hardly bring herself to remember her own private instrument of justice, the typewriter. The telephone bell rang, and as she hurried off to answer a voice which always seemed a proof of importance by itself, she felt that it was at this exact spot on the surface of the globe that all the subterranean wires of thought and progress came together. When she returned, with a message from the printer, she found that Mary was putting on her hat firmly, there was something imperious and dominating in her attitude altogether. "Look, Sally," she said, "these letters want copying. These I've not looked at. The question of the new census will have to be gone into carefully. But I'm going home now. Good night, Mr. Clacton. Good night, Sally." "We are very fortunate in our secretary, Mr. Clacton," said Mrs. Seal, pausing with her hand on the papers, as the door shut behind Mary. Mr. Clacton himself had been vaguely impressed by something in Mary's behavior towards him. He envisaged a time even when it would become necessary to tell her that there could not be two masters in one office, but she was certainly able. Very able, and in touch with a group of very clever young men. No doubt they had suggested to her some of her new ideas. He signified his assent to Mrs. Seal's remark, but observed, with a glance at the clock, which showed only half an hour past 5. "If she takes the work seriously, Mrs. Seal, but that's just what some of your clever young ladies don't do." So saying, he returned to his room, and Mrs. Seal, after a moment's hesitation, hurried back to her labors. Chapter 21. Mary walked to the nearest station and reached home in an incredibly short space of time, just so much, indeed, as was needed for the intelligent understanding of the news of the world as the Westminster Gazette reported it. Within a few minutes of opening her door, she was in trim for a hard evening's work. She unlocked a drawer and took out a manuscript, which consisted of a very few pages, entitled, in a forcible hand, "Some Aspects of the Democratic State." The aspects dwindled out in a crisscross of blotted lines in the very middle of a sentence, and suggested that the author had been interrupted, or convinced of the futility of proceeding, with her pen in the air. Oh, yes, Ralph had come in at that point. She scored that sheet very effectively, and, choosing a fresh one, began at a great rate with a generalization upon the structure of human society, which was a good deal bolder than her custom. Ralph had told her once that she couldn't write English, which accounted for those frequent blots and insertions. But she put all that behind her, and drove ahead with such words as came her way, until she had accomplished half a page of generalization and might legitimately draw breath. Directly her hand stopped, her brain stopped too, and she began to listen. A paper-boy shouted down the street, an omnibus ceased and lurched on again with the heave of duty once more shouldered. The dullness of the sounds suggested that a fog had risen since her return, if, indeed, a fog has power to deaden sound. Of which fact, she could not be sure at the present moment. It was the sort of fact Ralph Denham knew. At any rate, it was no concern of hers, and she was about to dip a pen when her ear was caught by the sound of a step upon the stone staircase. She followed it past Mr. Chippen's chambers, past Mr. Gibson's, past Mr. Turner's, after which it became her sound. A postman, a washerwoman, a circular, a bill. She presented herself with each of these perfectly natural possibilities. But, to her surprise, her mind rejected each one of them impatiently, even apprehensively. The step became slow, as it was apt to do at the end of the steep climb, and Mary, listening for the regular sound, was filled with an intolerable nervousness. Leaning against the table, she felt the knock of her heart push her body perceptibly backwards and forwards, a state of nerves astonishing and reprehensible in a stable woman. Grotesque fancies took shape. Alone, at the top of the house, an unknown person approaching nearer and nearer. How could she escape? There was no way of escape. She did not even know whether the oblong mark on the ceiling was a trapdoor to the roof or not. And if she got on to the roof, well, there was a drop of 60 feet or so on to the pavement. But she sat perfectly still, and when the knock sounded, she got up directly and opened the door without hesitation. She saw a tall figure outside, with something ominous to her eyes in the look of it. "What do you want?" she said, not recognizing the face in the fitful light of the staircase. "Mary? I'm Catherine Hilbery." Mary's self-possession returned almost excessively, and her welcome was decidedly cold, as if she must recoup herself for this ridiculous waste of emotion. She moved her green-shaded lamp to another table and covered some aspects of the democratic state with a sheet of blotting paper. "Why can't they leave me alone?" she thought bitterly, connecting Catherine and Ralph in a conspiracy to take from her even this hour of solitary study, even this poor little defense against the world. And, as she smoothed down the sheet of blotting paper over the manuscript, she braced herself to resist Catherine, whose presence struck her, not merely by its force, as usual, but as something in the nature of a menace. "You're working?" said Catherine, with hesitation, perceiving that she was not welcome. "Nothing that matters," Mary replied, drawing forward the best of the chairs and poking the fire. "I didn't know you had to work after you had left the office," said Catherine, in a tone which gave the impression that she was thinking of something else, as was, indeed, the case. She had been paying calls with her mother. And in between the calls Mrs. Hilbery had rushed into shops and bought pillowcases and blotting books on no perceptible method for the furnishing of Catherine's house. Catherine had a sense of impedimenta accumulating on all sides of her. She had left her at length, and had come on to keep an engagement to dine with Rodney at his room's, but she did not mean to get to him before 7 o'clock. And so had plenty of time to walk all the way from Bond Street to the Temple if she wished it. The flow of faces streaming on either side of her had hypnotized her into a mood of profound despondency, to which her expectation of an evening alone with Rodney contributed. They were very good friends again. Better friends, they both said, than ever before. So far as she was concerned, this was true. There were many more things in him than she had guessed until emotion brought them forth: strength, affection, sympathy. And she thought of them and looked at the faces passing, and thought how much alike they were, and how distant. Nobody feeling anything as she felt nothing, and distance, she thought, lay inevitably between the closest. And their intimacy was the worst presence of all. For, oh dear, she thought, looking into a tobacconist's window, I don't care for any of them, and I don't care for William. And people say this is the thing that matters most, and I can't see what they mean by it. She looked desperately at the smooth-bowled pipes, and wondered should she walk on by the Strand or by the Embankment. It was not a simple question, for it concerned not different streets so much as different streams of thought. If she went by the Strand, she would force herself to think out the problem of the future, or some mathematical problem. If she went by the river, she would certainly begin to think about things that didn't exist: the forest, the ocean beach, the leafy solitudes, the magnanimous hero. No, no, no. 1,000 times no. It wouldn't do. There was something repulsive in such thoughts at present. She must take something else. She was out of that mood at present. And then she thought of Mary. The thought gave her confidence, even pleasure of a sad sort, as if the triumph of Ralph and Mary proved that the fault of her failure lay with herself and not with life. An indistinct idea that the sight of Mary might be of help, combined with her natural trust in her, suggested a visit, for, surely, her liking was of a kind that implied liking upon Mary's side also. After a moment's hesitation she decided, although she seldom acted upon impulse, to act upon this one, and turned down a side street and found Mary's door. But her reception was not encouraging. Clearly Mary didn't want to see her, had no help to impart, and the half-formed desire to confide in her was quenched immediately. She was slightly amused at her own delusion, looked rather absent-minded, and swung her gloves to and fro, as if doling out the few minutes accurately before she could say goodbye. Those few minutes might very well be spent in asking for information as to the exact position of the suffrage bill, or in expounding her own very sensible view of the situation. But there was a tone in her voice, or a shade in her opinions, or a swing of her gloves which served to irritate Mary Datchet, whose manner became increasingly direct, abrupt, and even antagonistic. She became conscious of a wish to make Catherine realize the importance of this work, which she discussed so coolly. As though she, too, had sacrificed what Mary herself had sacrificed. The swinging of the glove ceased. And Catherine, after 10 minutes, began to make movements preliminary to departure. At the sight of this, Mary was aware she was abnormally aware of things tonight, of another very strong desire. Catherine was not to be allowed to go, to disappear into the free, happy world of irresponsible individuals. She must be made to realize, to feel. "I don't quite see," she said, as if Catherine had challenged her explicitly, "how, things being as they are, anyone can help trying, at least, to do something." But how are things? Mary pressed her lips, and smiled ironically. She had Catherine at her mercy. She could, if she liked, discharge upon her head wagon loads of revolting proof of the state of things ignored by the casual, the amateur, the looker-on, the cynical observer of life at a distance. And yet she hesitated. As usual, when she found herself in talk with Catherine, she began to feel rapid alternations of opinion about her. Arrows of sensation striking strangely through the envelope of personality, which shelters us so conveniently from our fellows. What an egoist, how aloof she was! And yet, not in her words, perhaps, but in her voice, in her face, in her attitude, there were signs of a soft brooding spirit, of a sensibility unblunted and profound, playing over her thoughts and deeds, and investing her manner with an habitual gentleness. The arguments and phrases of Mr. Clacton fell flat against such armor. "You'll be married, and you'll have other things to think of," she said inconsequently, and with an accent of condescension. She was not going to make Catherine understand in a second, as she would, all she herself had learnt at the cost of such pain. Catherine was to be happy, Catherine was to be ignorant, Mary was to keep this knowledge of the impersonal life for herself. The thought of her morning's renunciation stung her conscience, and she tried to expand once more into that impersonal condition which was so lofty and so painless. She must check this desire to be an individual again, whose wishes were in conflict with those of other people. She repented of her bitterness. Catherine now renewed her signs of leave-taking. She had drawn on one of her gloves, and looked about her as if in search of some trivial saying to end with. Wasn't there some picture, or clock, or chest of drawers which might be singled out for notice? Something peaceable and friendly to end the uncomfortable interview? The green-shaded lamp burnt in the corner, and illumined books and pens and blotting paper. The whole aspect of the place started another train of thought and struck her as enviably free. In such a room one could work, one could have a life of one's own. "I think you're very lucky," she observed. "I envy you, living alone and having your own things." And engaged in this exalted way, which had no recognition or engagement ring, she added in her own mind. Mary's lips parted slightly. She could not conceive in what respects Catherine, who spoke sincerely, could envy her. "I don't think you've got any reason to envy me," she said. "Perhaps one always envies other people," Catherine observed vaguely. "Well, but you've got everything that anyone can want." Catherine remained silent. She gazed into the fire quietly, and without a trace of self-consciousness. The hostility which she had divined in Mary's tone had completely disappeared, and she forgot that she had been upon the point of going. "Well, I suppose I have," she said at length. "And yet I sometimes think she paused. She did not know how to express what she meant. "It came over me in the tube the other day," she resumed, with a smile. "What is it that makes these people go one way rather than the other? It's not love, it's not reason, I think it must be some idea. Perhaps, Mary, our affections are the shadow of an idea. Perhaps there isn't any such thing as affection in itself. She spoke half-mockingly, asking her question, which she scarcely troubled to frame, not of Mary, or of anyone in particular. But the words seemed to Mary Datchet shallow, supercilious, cold-blooded, and cynical all in one. All her natural instincts were roused in revolt against them. "I'm the opposite way of thinking, you see," she said. "Yes, I know you are," Catherine replied, looking at her as if now she were about, perhaps, to explain something very important. Mary could not help feeling the simplicity and good faith that lay behind Catherine's words. "I think affection is the only reality," she said. "Yes," said Catherine, almost sadly. She understood that Mary was thinking of Ralph, and she felt it impossible to press her to reveal more of this exalted condition. She could only respect the fact that, in some few cases, life arranged itself thus satisfactorily and pass on. She rose to her feet accordingly. But Mary exclaimed, with unmistakable earnestness, that she must not go, that they met so seldom, that she wanted to talk to her so much. Catherine was surprised at the earnestness with which she spoke. It seemed to her that there could be no indiscretion in mentioning Ralph by name. Seating herself, "For 10 minutes, she said, "by the way, Mr. Denham told me he was going to give up the bar and live in the country." "Has he gone?" "He thinks of it," said Mary briefly. The color at once came to her face. "It would be a very good plan," said Catherine in her decided way. "You think so?" "Yes, because he would do something worthwhile, he would write a book. My father always says that he's the most remarkable of the young men who write for him." Mary bent low over the fire and stirred the coal between the bars with a poker. Catherine's mention of Ralph had roused within her an almost irresistible desire to explain to her the true state of the case between herself and Ralph. She knew, from the tone of her voice, that in speaking of Ralph she had no desire to probe Mary's secrets, or to insinuate any of her own. Moreover, she liked Catherine, she trusted her, she felt a respect for her. The first step of confidence was comparatively simple, but a further confidence had revealed itself, as Catherine spoke. Which was not so simple, and yet it impressed itself upon her as a necessity. She must tell Catherine what it was clear that she had no conception of. She must tell Catherine that Ralph was in love with her. "I don't know what he means to do," she said hurriedly, seeking time against the pressure of her own conviction. "I've not seen him since Christmas." Catherine reflected that this was odd. Perhaps, after all, she had misunderstood the position. She was in the habit of assuming, however, that she was rather unobservant of the finer shades of feeling. And she noted her present failure as another proof that she was a practical, abstract-minded person, better fitted to deal with figures than with the feelings of men and women. Anyhow, William Rodney would say so. "And now dash," she said. "Oh, please stay," Mary exclaimed, putting out her hand to stop her. Directly Catherine moved she felt, inarticulately and violently, that she could not bear to let her go. If Catherine went, her only chance of speaking was lost, her only chance of saying something tremendously important was lost. Half a dozen words were sufficient to wake Catherine's attention, and put flight and further silence beyond her power. But although the words came to her lips, her throat closed upon them and drove them back. After all, she considered, why should she speak? Because it is right, her instinct told her, right to expose oneself without reservations to other human beings. She flinched from the thought. It asked too much of one already stripped bare. Something she must keep of her own. But if she did keep something of her own? Immediately she figured an immured life, continuing for an immense period, the same feelings living forever, neither dwindling nor changing within the ring of a thick stone wall. The imagination of this loneliness frightened her, and yet to speak to lose her loneliness, for it had already become dear to her, was beyond her power. Her hand went down to the hem of Catherine's skirt, and, fingering a line of fur, she bent her head as if to examine it. "I like this fur," she said. "I like your clothes. And you mustn't think that I'm going to marry Ralph," she continued, in the same tone. "Because he doesn't care for me at all. He cares for someone else." Her head remained bent, and her hand still rested upon the skirt. "It's a shabby old dress," said Catherine, and the only sign that Mary's words had reached her was that she spoke with a little jerk. "You don't mind my telling you that?" said Mary, raising herself. "No, no," said Catherine, "but you're mistaken, aren't you?" She was, in truth, horribly uncomfortable, dismayed, indeed, disillusioned. She disliked the turn things had taken quite intensely. The indecency of it afflicted her. The suffering implied by the tone appalled her. She looked at Mary furtively, with eyes that were full of apprehension. But if she had hoped to find that these words had been spoken without understanding of their meaning, she was at once disappointed. Mary lay back in her chair, frowning slightly, and looking, Catherine thought, as if she had lived 15 years or so in the space of a few minutes. "There are some things, don't you think, that one can't be mistaken about?" Mary said, quietly and almost coldly. "That is what puzzles me about this question of being in love. I've always prided myself upon being reasonable," she added. "I didn't think I could have felt this. I mean, if the other person didn't. I was foolish. I let myself pretend." Here she paused. "For, you see, Catherine," she proceeded, rousing herself and speaking with greater energy, "I am in love. There's no doubt about that. I'm tremendously in love. With Ralph." The little forward shake of her head, which shook a lock of hair, together with her brighter color, gave her an appearance at once proud and defiant. Catherine thought to herself, "That's how it feels then." She hesitated, with a feeling that it was not for her to speak, and then said, in a low tone, "You've got that." "Yes," said Mary, "I've got that. One wouldn't not be in love. But I didn't mean to talk about that, I only wanted you to know. There's another thing I want to tell you." She paused. "I haven't any authority from Ralph to say it, but I'm sure of this: he's in love with you." Catherine looked at her again, as if her first glance must have been deluded, for, surely, there must be some outward sign that Mary was talking in an excited, or bewildered, or fantastic manner. No, she still frowned, as if she sought her way through the clauses of a difficult argument, but she still looked more like one who reasons than one who feels. "That proves that you're mistaken, utterly mistaken," said Catherine, speaking reasonably, too. She had no need to verify the mistake by a glance at her own recollections. When the fact was so clearly stamped upon her mind that if Ralph had any feeling towards her it was one of critical hostility. She did not give the matter another thought, and Mary, now that she had stated the fact, did not seek to prove it, but tried to explain to herself, rather than to Catherine, her motives in making the statement. She had nerved herself to do what some large and imperious instinct demanded her doing. She had been swept on the breast of a wave beyond her reckoning. "I've told you," she said, "because I want you to help me. I don't want to be jealous of you. And I am fearfully jealous. The only way, I thought, was to tell you." She hesitated, and groped in her endeavor to make her feelings clear to herself. "If I tell you, then we can talk, and when I'm jealous, I can tell you. And if I'm tempted to do something frightfully mean, I can tell you, you could make me tell you. I find talking so difficult, but loneliness frightens me. I should shut it up in my mind. Yes, that's what I'm afraid of. Going about with something in my mind all my life that never changes. I find it so difficult to change. Ralph Denham said that? Said Catherine, with considerable indignation. In order to have produced such suffering in Mary, it seemed to her that he must have behaved with extreme callousness. It seemed to her that he had discarded the friendship, when it suited his convenience to do so, with some falsely philosophical theory which made his conduct all the worse. She was going on to express herself thus, had not Mary at once interrupted her. "No, no," she said, "you don't understand." Her voice faltered into silence. It was borne in upon her how completely in running her risk she had lost her prize, lost it so entirely that she had no longer the right, in talking of Ralph, to presume that her knowledge of him supplanted all other knowledge. She no longer completely possessed her love, since his share in it was doubtful, and now, to make things yet more bitter, her clear vision of the way to face life was rendered tremulous and uncertain, because another was witness of it. Feeling her desire for the old unshared intimacy too great to be borne without tears, she rose, walked to the farther end of the room, held the curtains apart, and stood there mastered for a moment. The grief itself was not ignoble, the sting of it lay in the fact that she had been led to this act of treachery against herself. Trapped, cheated, robbed, first by Ralph and then by Catherine, she seemed all dissolved in humiliation, and bereft of anything she could call her own. Tears of weakness welled up and rolled down her cheeks. But tears, at least, she could control and would this instant, and then, turning, she would face Catherine and retrieve what could be retrieved of the collapse of her courage. She turned. Catherine had not moved, she was leaning a little forward in her chair and looking into the fire. Something in the attitude reminded Mary of Ralph. So he would sit, leaning forward, looking rather fixedly in front of him, while his mind went far away, exploring, speculating, until he broke off with his, "Well, Mary?" And the silence, that had been so full of romance to her, gave way to the most delightful talk that she had ever known. Something unfamiliar in the pose of the silent figure, something still, solemn, significant about it, made her hold her breath. She paused. Her thoughts were without bitterness. She was surprised by her own quiet and confidence. She came back silently, and sat once more by Catherine's side. Mary had no wish to speak. In the silence she seemed to have lost her isolation, she was at once the sufferer and the pitiful spectator of suffering. She was happier than she had ever been, she was more bereft, she was rejected, and she was immensely belle of addition. Attempt to express these sensations was vain. And, moreover, she could not help believing that, without any words on her side, they were sure addition. Thus for some time longer they sat silent, side by side, while Mary fingered the fur on the skirt of the old dress.